Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Lydia Vagts and Annette Manick.
Thank you, Jasmine, and welcome to our view of a slightly different perspective from both Patricia Hills and Erica Hirschler's. This morning, I'm going to speak about paintings, oil paintings in the museum's collection, including portraits, landscapes, and the murals, and then Annette will follow me to speak about the watercolors. As illustrations of my points about Sargent's materials and techniques, I'll be using paintings from our own collection in chronological order and finishing up with the murals. As you've already heard from both Pat Hills and Erica Hirschler, Sargent's talent as an artist was recognized very early on by his family, and eventually they brought him to Paris around 1874 to study. Sargent enrolled in classes in various different artist studios and also attended lessons at the École des Beaux-Arts. There he would have learned in the traditional fashion, beginning with particularly lessons in drawing, both starting with plaster casts and then moving on to live models, progressing from drawing to then studies in oil paint. And as you see here, on the left, you see a pencil sketch from about 1874 of a male nude posing in the studio, and on the right, a female figure, a portrait head, from about 1877. In the portrait study, you can already see the beginning of Sargent's later techniques, the beautiful modeling of the flesh tones, these gorgeous sort of thin shadows in the midtones, and then finally sort of very sketchy background laid on. Sargent did work in various studios with other artists, but obviously his main influence was the artist Carolus Duran. And you see here on the left his portrait, his painting, Lady with the Glove, from 1869. And on the right, you see a view of Carolus Duran in his own studio. The Lady with the Glove shows Carolus Duran at sort of the peak of his portrait power, with beautiful modulations of the black dress, and also very beautiful but fairly tightly painted flesh tones there. And it's a pretty classically French kind of painting. I bring the picture up on the right of Carolus Duran in his studio, partly because you get a sense of the kind of exotic props that artists would have had in their studio at the time, and also because there he is playing an instrument. I can't even identify what kind of instrument that is exactly, but clearly it was an important part of his studio. This next image shows Sargent's own portrait of Carolus Duran from 1879, that's in the collection at the Clark Art Institute, and shows just how much Sargent was influenced by his teacher. You see the same use of very similar tonalities, the same balancing of lights and darks, but it is important to see that Sargent was clearly already in details such as the cuffs here and some of the handling of the fabrics, moving beyond Carolus Duran in a much more free expression of the brushwork. As many have pointed out, Carolus Duran's mantra to all of his students was to study and copy and attempt to paint like the old masters, and in particular, Velázquez and Frans Hals. And you see here a copy of a Velázquez portrait of Philip V that Sargent painted most likely directly in the Prado. And in this image here of Sargent's studio, you see he painted many, many different versions of both Velázquez, copies of Velázquez works and Hals. And here you see in this corner a large-scale copy of a Velázquez painting, and here a copy of Portraits by Franz Hals, which clearly he treasured as he had them framed and kept them in his studio. And also, like his mentor, you see here his beloved piano, which he played frequently during portrait painting sessions. One of the earliest Sargents, chronologically speaking, in our collection is the Oyster Gatherers at Cancale from 1878. And here you see Sargent depicting the fisherwomen heading off to collect the oysters on a brilliant sunny day with lots of clouds in the sky. And in particular, you see the beautiful brushwork used to just catch the sunlight hitting their backs, the highlights on their shoulders and things, as well as the reflections in these very freely painted pools of water on the sand there. They're very sketchily painted in many ways, and in contrast, as you see here in this image, there were two versions, the one painted for the Paris Salon and then the one painted for New York. This is the version in the Corcoran's collection, painted for a Parisian audience. And this is our version down here, painted for an American audience. And you see how much more tightly painted and more detailed the Corcoran's version is. When Sarah Cash was preparing the catalog for her show Sargent and the Sea at the Corcoran a few years ago, we were very fortunate to have the opportunity to bring both the Corcoran's version of the painting and ours into their conservation studio so we could examine them side by side, because there are a great many questions about which version would have come first. And we weren't able to conclusively prove one way or another, but we did make some very interesting observations about the paintings, including the fact that our version is literally almost precisely 50% smaller than the Corcoran's version. And if you look at this drawing done in Photoshop, you'll see it's an overlay. If you enlarge our version 50% and overlay the composition directly over a tracing of the Corcoran's, they're almost exactly the same. There's very little change there. And we found no signs of grid lines. We found no traditional tracing methods on either of the paintings. So we know he was very talented, but we don't know whether or not he was so talented that he could precisely duplicate a painting 50% larger or smaller, just freehand. So the question remains, what methods did Sargent use to transfer his compositions? And there are several other series of works where Sargent painted duplicates almost either the exact same size or proportionally equal, and without any sign as to how that would have happened. In this view of another one of Sargent's studios, you see here something that seems to be some kind of a magic lantern or a stereopticon. We know Sargent was very interested in photography. He had his paintings photographed after they were painted. And although we're probably jumping to conclusions, we think that perhaps Sargent would have used photography of his paintings as a tool for enlargement in some fashion, perhaps with the use of a magic lantern, and maybe he projected it onto a new support. We will come back to this theme in just a little bit. This is Sargent's portrait of Louisa Cushing Boyt from 1887. She was the wife of Edward Darley Boyt, to whom we owe basically this beautiful exhibition of watercolors, and the mother of our 4 lovely little girls up in the Sargent Gallery. Those of you who've read Erica's book about the Boyts will know already that Louisa, or Isa as she was known, was quite a character, and her portrait reflects this. You see the smile on her face, the slightly droopy eyelid that almost looks like she's winking. And she certainly seems to have a very jaunty expression on her face that kind of matches her fun, feathery headdress thing on her head. Sargent painted this portrait over the course of approximately 30 sittings, which were frequently delayed partly because of Louisa's health issues. And he made many changes to the composition, and it's hard to see, but there are changes here to the position of the sofa, changes to the legs down there, a little bit of change in the hands, which you actually can't see anymore. This portrait really is a perfect example of Sargent's mastery of texture in particular. You have the contrast of the satin of the belt there and the bodice, the tulle netting over the pink satin, the rich sheen of the velvet there. It's all just beautifully painted. And of course, there's also all the beautiful paint on the sofa itself. The portrait was treated several years ago in anticipation of the opening of the American wing and gave us the opportunity to really look at it closely and to remove many, many years' worth of grime and discolored varnish, which really helped to bring out the contrast of those different textures. And you see here, this is before cleaning, a detail of Louisa's arm resting on the cushion there. And at the time, it was so dirty, we didn't actually realize that the highlights were painted with these very beautiful sort of periwinkle and purple strokes. In this image here, you see up here a during cleaning view of the skirt, and here after cleaning. And you see just how that thick yellow varnish just made everything sort of a dull orange. We really were unprepared for the vibrancy of that pink skirt contrasting with the black polka dots. And you also couldn't really, it was very difficult when the painting was in the galleries to see details like these beautiful little blue strokes there, or there's that little sort of blue-green stroke right there. And I show a close-up of those blue strokes here just to show how Sargent could go back in at a later time and drag sort of dry color across the dry paint to help reinforce the folds of the drapery, and also just how sort of quick and rapid. It was just clearly just a very quick brushstroke that made those lovely polka dots. And also, Sargent was very much a master of painting blacks, but as is the case with so many artists, his blacks were not really black in the end, and often had no black in them at all. And you can see in this detail of one of the polka dots that basically that's just a big circle of pure ultramarine. But seen from a distance in the galleries, you would in fact swear that it is black. And I show this view here. This is a shot of the skirt in ultraviolet light. And UV light causes natural resins and other materials to fluoresce in particular colors. And on the left side here, you see the unclean side, still with a very heavy layer of varnish. And on the right, you see this brilliant orange glow, and that is proof of Sargent's quite heavy use of alizarin or other lake pigments, because they typically fluoresce that kind of orange color. And Sargent loved lake pigments and used them frequently, but we are very fortunate in that, for the most part, in his oil paintings, they do not fade, and we do not find issues with fading of lake pigments. This next image, the head of an Arab from 1891, which is currently on view in the watercolor show, I'm showing just briefly as a way to demonstrate Sargent's use of the ground or preparation layer as a tone in his paintings. Sargent, for the most part, always preferred to use a light gray colored ground if possible. He favored a tightly woven, lightweight linen. He sometimes prepared the canvases himself. Other times he bought them commercially prepared, but the gray tone was his preference. And you can see that primarily it is everywhere, but it also will occasionally peek out. You can see it used as a tone itself in various of his paintings. This next image is our portrait of Helen Sears, as you see on the left, up in the Sargent Gallery, dating from 1895. And on the right, you see a photograph of Helen taken by her mother, Sarah Choate Sears, who was a good friend of Sargent's and a noted photographer. And as you can see, Helen is wearing the same dress and those fabulous shoes in both paintings, but it's an interesting illustration in Sargent's editing process. There are many details, particularly of the dress, that such as this sort of ruffled hem, that Sargent clearly didn't want to include because here in the actual portrait, it's a solid piece of fabric. So he would have just eliminated any details that he felt were extraneous. Just as Sargent was a master of blacks, he was also a master of whites. And as his blacks are not really black, his whites are not white either. In this view of the yoke of Helen's and neck of Helen's dress, here you see, the version, a detail of the painting before cleaning, during cleaning, and obviously after cleaning. And one of the beauties of removing a dark, discolored, grimy varnish is that you can reveal things that weren't seen before, such as this yellow stroke right here, the purple that was harder to see, and up here on her shoulder is just a very pale pink stroke, all of which were covered up by the varnish before, but show how Sargent rarely painted pure white, even though it is very obviously a white dress. Sargent was able to create form very quickly with speed and accuracy, which I think if you're painting a 6-year-old is probably really important because I doubt she stood still for very long. These two views of Helen's hand show just how sketchy, I mean, it really looks like a perfectly proportional hand, but there's very little brushwork used to convey the structure of that hand as it reaches out to do who knows what to that hydrangea. And one of the delights of cleaning is to reveal some of the other strokes that you couldn't see before, the slight definition there of the fingernail that just comes from a little bit more pink paint at the end of that stroke. I show this detail here of the hem of Helen's dress, partly to illustrate the fact that as the white paint sort of peters out at the end there, you see this reddish brown tone. Sargent would have been trained to block in his colors, the mass of forms in his paintings. He often did that with a kind of earth-toned wash of very thin pigment over his gray ground. And that's what you see poking through here. And it's interesting to note that although the hem seems very definite, and looking at the painting, you would always view it as a very crisp piece of painting, the white paint just sort of comes to an end there, and the definition comes from these blue, purpley blue strokes right there. And I showed this detail to illustrate Sargent working very much wet over dry in many areas. Because he did multiple sittings, and I'm sure particularly with a 6-year-old, he could drag these very luscious green strokes over the paint there without blending them in. And so you also have those details there that gain in definition because there is no blending with the wet paint below. Here we have the artist in his studio, also downstairs in the exhibition from 1904, and it depicts Sargent's friend and fellow artist, Ambrogio Raffaele, working in a small bedroom, possibly in a lodging house or a hotel. Once again, the white drapery here shows just how much of a master of whites and fabric Sargent was, as it really dominates the composition. This detail of the head of the artist and the palette shows, in many ways, a very traditionally organized artist palette. Typically, artists would have laid their pigments across the palette, moving from the darkest pigments to the lightest, as you see here, the blacks, the blues, greens, moving over to the whites and the yellows. I also really love this detail because of the way you see just how Sargent outlines. Clearly, he laid on the pigments in the palette very thickly after the figure was done, and you can see how the brushstrokes emphasize the outlines of the hand and the profile there. Sargent's own palette, and this is a version that comes from the collection at the Strauss Center at Harvard, would have been organized in the same fashion. This one's incredibly messy, so it's hard to tell that that is in fact the case, but it does in fact reflect that somewhere in there. And it is very interesting to note that this palette, it has a certain level of grime on it, but it's a mess. But he was still able, from that mess of a palette, to pull out beautiful, clear tones and brushstrokes of almost pure color. Sargent was not adventurous in the pigments that he chose to use. He used very stable pigments. He used traditional pigments, a lot of earth pigments, ivory black. His reds were usually vermilions and red leads, and also, of course, his beloved alizarin and other lakes. His yellows, he used a cadmium yellow, chrome yellow, cobalt blue, ultramarine, and then obviously enormous quantities of lead white. But he did not experiment with a lot of the pigments being introduced by chemical companies in the late 19th and early 20th century. Sargent loved painting out of doors, as you'll certainly hear more from Annette about. And I show this really just to illustrate his very simple setup there with the easel and the canvas that he undoubtedly stretched himself. And we know that in many instances he would have unstretched those canvases after painting them and tacked them possibly to another support, maybe separated with corks for transport, because we see on many of his sketches the little outlines of the cork shapes in the corners of those canvases. The Master and His Pupils from 1914 is almost sort of the reverse or reflection of the photograph I just showed, where you see the artist up there with a similar setup and just a tantalizing glimpse of what is being painted there, and whether it's an oil paint or a watercolor is almost impossible to tell. But unlike his portraits, clearly the figures are so unimportant in this painting. You almost don't notice them as you look at it, because what's really the highlight and focus are the light playing over the rocks here. And it's interesting to note, if you go down and look at this painting in the gallery, how thinly painted many of the areas of the trees and the rocks in the shadowy side, and even the figures are painted. And it just builds more and more and more paint as you get to these the highlights on these rocks there. And I show you a close-up just so you can see this sort of the three-dimensional quality of those brushstrokes there, and also how within one white brushstroke you could also have all of these streaks of pink perfectly blended in, and how he managed that is still a mystery to me, particularly if you think back to that messy palette. As you've heard in the previous lectures, Sargent basically all but abandoned portrait painting in the late 1890s and into the 20th century to devote himself to mural painting and to his watercolors. We are so fortunate here at the MFA to have one of his 3 mural cycles right in the building, and also to have received very generous funding in 1998 to restore the rotunda and colonnade, which gave us the opportunity to finally get up close to the murals and the sculptures and really examine them. I show 2 views here of the rotunda as it would have been constructed in 1907, I think it was. Sargent had just been working on his murals at the Boston Public Library, and the trustees were so impressed with his work there that they asked Sargent to come to the MFA and decorate, add his own decorative cycle to the rotunda. And I would imagine that what they had in mind was maybe some nice little decorations in these niches right there. Sargent agreed, but on the condition that essentially they deconstruct the entire rotunda, which they did only 7 years after finishing it. And also, this is a view of the staircase, and if you cast your mind to the current colonnade, you'll see the columns were originally evenly spaced. And when Sargent was asked to expand his decorative cycle to include the colonnade, he made them move the columns so that they'd be grouped in 2s so that you could look up to his murals on the ceiling as you came up the staircase. And once again, they did it. Sargent had used a lot of 3-dimensional objects as part of his decorative scheme at the BPL, including jewels and gilded metal shapes and even different textured wallpapers. And so he really came to love working in 3 dimensions. Because of this, his original plan for the decorative cycle at the MFA was to do it all in sculpture, which seems inconceivable to us, but that was what he was aiming for. And this plaque shows one of the murals in its original form as a small clay medallion. The medallion would have fit into this model, which you see in a photograph taken in the Coke Gallery back when it was a tapestry gallery. And Sargent, as he had done with the BPL, had scale models of the space made so that he could try out various ideas that he had for compositions. And these are 2 views of the interior of the model. And in this one, over here, you see that plaque that we saw before. And it's hard to make out, but that's a light bulb that he hung over the top of the oculus to illuminate the space, because at the time that was the only source of illumination in the rotunda. This image here shows what was immediately apparent to Sargent as a problem, and that is that if the light is only coming from the top, the upper portion of the dome is almost completely dark, and therefore any sort of bas-relief or sculpture would be illegible because there would be no light to cast relief. So Sargent was forced to rethink his plans in terms of doing everything in sculpture. And you see here on the left, once again, the original little plaque, and on the right, the final painted version. And this is particularly beloved of us in conservation because the title of the painting is Architecture, Painting, and Sculpture, Protected by Athena from the Ravages of Time. And we feel that that expresses our mission in this building. Sargent used a wide variety of models to pose for all of the different figures in the mural cycle. And I show this picture just because it's my favorite picture ever of anything having to do with the murals, because it's a stuffed leopard propped up on pillows and right here on a cigar box. And also do note the charcoal sketches of the figures pinned up against the wall. And you'll see in this version of classic and romantic art, there is the leopard sort of nestling up to Pan's leg there. And then those sketches, which became those two figures. The paintings were all painted, they're all oil on canvas, very thinly painted. Sargent used, we speculate that he was aiming to imitate the look of a true fresco in his effects, because he had kind of abandoned all of the bravura brushwork that you see in the portraits, and they're very simple, thinly painted oil paint on a, usually, unfortunately, he was only able to get a white preparation on his canvases, and he complained about that a lot. He really wanted to stick with his gray, but couldn't get canvases that large with a gray preparation. There also is no varnish on the surface, which helps to preserve that matte, fresco-like appearance. The paintings were painted either in his studio in London, or some were also painted in a studio that he had on Columbus Ave here in Boston, and then transported to the museum for placement on the walls with a technique called maraflage, which involved preparing both the wall and the reverse of the canvas with an adhesive made of lead white pigment and linseed oil. The walls would have been prepared, the back of the canvas, then it would have been pressed into place. They would have used rollers to really stick it onto the wall, and then would have placed boards up against the surface and held it in place with these sticks, because it took several days for the adhesive to dry. Once the murals were stuck in place, any air pockets were actually little slits could be made in those air pockets, and the air released, and then we found areas where there were tacks along those slits just to make sure the adhesion was perfect. We have many questions about how Sargent painted these murals, which were not, in fact, answered by getting up close to them when we finally had the scaffolding erected in 1998. Unlike what Annette will show you with Sargent's use of underdrawing in the watercolors, we did not find that in the murals. And really, we found absolutely no signs. This is a view of Perseus on Pegasus slaying the Medusa. And we found literally no grid marks, no pouncing, nothing to indicate how Sargent would have put the composition there. And there are also virtually no pentiments to show that he changed it in any way. And you see in this next image, this is one of our smaller scale studies, which I think may be hanging in the lower rotunda now, so you could go take a look at it there. In this, we do see changes. Over here, you can see that Sargent possibly enlarged the composition on that side. There are changes here, there are changes to the wing there, and then there are also these pencil lines that go there, but we don't find any corresponding marks in the final murals. So once again, we were confronted with the mystery of how exactly did Sargent enlarge his compositions. So fortunately for us, Sargent's assistant on the murals in Boston, the architect Thomas Fox, took incredible numbers of photographs of Sargent at work. Well, unfortunately, Sargent wasn't in them, but he took photographs of the murals and sculptures as they were being created. And amongst them, we found this very curious, very small drawing, and we know it's small because these here are thumbtacks. And it certainly doesn't look anything like what you would consider a traditional Sargent drawing. It's basically just a series of quite heavy outlines, but certainly that is the composition of the painting. And then we found a series of images of this painting in the process of its creation. And you see here how there's a very heavy outline, which looks very much like that outline, and then just the beginnings of the laying in of paint. And these are two more images of various steps along the way. Thomas Fox's nephew actually mentioned that amongst all of the belongings that he found in Thomas Fox's estate was a magic lantern. So we have become really convinced at this point in time that Sargent would have used some kind of projection device to take that very small drawing and project it onto, that mural is 10 feet by 10 feet, to project it onto that and then outline the composition with a sort of red-brown tone, and then gradually fill in all of the different compositional elements, culminating in all the details such as the wings there, the snakes of Medusa's head, Perseus' elaborate headdress. For those of you who remember what the rotunda looked like before the treatment in 1998, you'll see that essentially there was just this white background, this really unattractive yellow background here to the bas-reliefs, and the paintings kind of registered as sort of dark holes, dark circles and shapes up in the ceiling. And I was walking through the rotunda at one point, and I had somebody stop me and say, somebody told me that there are Sargents somewhere in this building and that he painted murals. Could you tell me where they are? And we were, of course, standing right below them, but they just didn't register in anyone's consciousness. The funding we were given initially by the Getty Conservation Institute allowed us to go ahead and treat the paintings. Well, originally it was just to be the paintings, but then over the course of the treatment, we discovered that Sargent had actually created everything in the rotunda. He made the bas-reliefs. He made the decorative elements. He chose the molding. He designed these vases. There is nothing in the rotunda and the colonnade that Sargent did not design himself. So the project greatly expanded in scope. For the paintings, however, the treatment was fortunately relatively straightforward. They were covered with decades worth of grime and soot and coal tar residues, cigarette smoke from smoking at parties in the rotunda, and all kinds of things. They responded beautifully to a water-based treatment, and you can see here just how dirty it was. It was very satisfying to remove all of those decades of grime. In other areas, certain of Sargent's pigments did not respond well to water-based treatments, such as that blue tone there, and were forced to choose dry methods, which essentially involved using an eraser and erasing the grime off the surface and then brushing the eraser crumbs away. My last image here shows the rotunda as it appears today, with new restoration of the sculptures, new lighting. This wall there was created especially for the space, and you may remember the heavy concrete wall that was there beforehand. And we hope that it returns the entire space to what Sargent would have wanted the whole environment to be in that space, as opposed to just paintings cut out and pasted into a space. I hope you will take a long and winding tour, either on your way to or from the watercolors through the rotunda and maybe up to the Sargent Gallery to look at the paintings there and maybe see some of the details that I showed you today, although I guess you probably shouldn't get too close or the guards will get upset. So now I am going to turn things over to Annette, who will talk to you about the watercolors.
Good morning and welcome to the last section of All Things Sargent. I think most of you have gone to the previous lectures by Patricia Hills and Erica Hirschler. And as Erica said, I'm going to be talking about the watercolors. And as we also have heard from previous speakers, portraiture was work. BPL, MFA, Harvard mural projects, work, work, and more work. And then there were the watercolors. They were Sargent's pleasure. They were his escape. They were his breath of fresh air. This morning I'll be talking a bit about his working technique in watercolor and the materials and equipment that he had available to him, and also sharing some observations that were made in the course of working on the current watercolor exhibition in the Gun Gallery. The first observation I'd like to share is a somewhat obvious one, but an important one in thinking about the watercolors, and that is that the subjects are mostly outdoor subjects and reflect his lifelong love of being outdoors, of traveling and exploring, and his comfort in working out of doors. Here we see Sargent working in oil on the right and on the left working in watercolor. And from the start, we have a sense of a little bit different working setup, sitting down for watercolor, standing up for oil, excuse me, and also a difference in size and scale. Watercolor, smaller format and intrinsically more portable than oil painting, even when his setup in oil is meant to be portable. Focusing on the image of him painting in watercolor, obviously, because that's what I'll be talking about, we see a comfort of Sargent in this landscape. This is clearly something he's familiar doing. He's very settled on the hillside. In this case, I don't even think he's sitting on a camp stool. We see his foot propped on a rock. He has his sturdy hiking shoes on, his gaiters, and I dare say this is not his Sunday finery that he's painting in out of doors. We are going to start with the sketching umbrellas, probably the most cumbersome piece of equipment he would have had in taking his work out of doors. The sketching umbrellas were used for watercolor as well as for oil painting. I think because of the very white reflective surface of watercolor paper, probably even more essential for watercolor than for oil painting. The purpose of the sketching umbrellas was twofold: to control reflections and glare of light, but also to protect the artist from gusts of wind. And very nicely, we see how the pole here separates into two pieces to make it a little bit more portable. But again, I think this was probably the most cumbersome piece of equipment for Sargent to carry around with him. And the camp stools, which show up in other photographs of Sargent painting outdoors. The sketching easel, or the watercolor easel, very different from an oil painting easel. If you remember from the earlier photograph, this is smaller in scale, a little bit more lightweight. The format and size of watercolor smaller again than working in oil, but also the angle of the work area here for working in watercolor, not vertical as Sargent worked in oil. And there's a very simple reason for that. If you're working in wet, washy watercolor and your paper is on the vertical, those washes, gravity's going to take its toll and they're just going to run down your sheet. Sometimes you would want them to, but you'd also want the ability to control that. And one of the features of many watercolor easels was a tiltable head that allowed you to adjust the angle of the workspace. So if you had a renegade watercolor running out of control, the astute artist would quickly tilt their platen and be able to redirect it, hopefully in the way that they wanted it to run. Also, what we see here are adjustable legs, which play out in the field on the hillside, where he could adjust the easel so that it was still sturdy on a not flat surface. And I love the detail here, trying to woo prospective buyers of how small this easel will close up, and sure to get many people to buy it to take it out into the hills. Paper. Watercolor can be painted on virtually any kind of paper, but specific paper was made for working in watercolor, precisely because, especially if you're working in wet washes and wetting and re-wetting the paper, you want a paper that's sturdy enough to hold up to that. Watercolor paper is a little thicker typically than the normal paper, and also is coated with a sizing material, typically gelatin, traditionally gelatin. The reason for that coating material is to keep the watercolor paint on the surface of the paper rather than allowing it to sink in and stain the paper fibers. By keeping the paint on the surface, an artist was better able to manipulate the paint and control different effects. For those of you who might be watercolorists yourself, or others who may have spilled water on paper, you will be aware of the effect of water on paper, which is usually for the paper to start to cockle and buckle, and as it dries, similarly, it's never as flat as it was to begin with. To work on a flat surface, which would be advantageous for a lot of reasons, there were many ways of an artist restraining a piece of paper. The simplest would be to tack the edges on a wood board. You could glue the edges to a wooden board. Artists' prepared watercolor papers were sold that were already attached to cardboard, and there were simpler and more elaborate contraptions called sketching frames, which would close down on a piece of paper and restrict movement of that paper. Additionally, paper was sold in watercolor blocks and still is sold in watercolor blocks. Paper would be trimmed to size, stacked together, and held around the edges with adhesive and a gauze fabric. The papers were sold in a variety of sizes, and one could buy portfolio containers to protect the paper. The papers were also sold with different surface treatments, from smooth to rough. Sargent seems to have preferred moderately rough to rough watercolor papers, and based on the MFA and the Brooklyn collections, he favored Whatman paper from a British mill, and also the Brooklyn collection shows some papers made on, some watercolors made on Fabriano paper from an Italian mill. Both collections have papers on Arnold and Foster, also a British paper mill. This is a modern watercolor block. The black here is around all four edges. That holds the block, the stack of papers together, and in order to separate your top sheet, one would insert the palette knife under the top sheet and work it around the edges to release the sheet. We know that Sargent worked with watercolor blocks in the Boston and Brooklyn collections. Again, many of the watercolors show traces of adhesive around the edges and also fibers from that gauze fabric that's used to hold the block together. Brushes. Sargent loved to paint with a fistful of brushes, and he was fond of telling people that he liked to paint with a fistful of brushes. And certainly the photographs of Sargent painting in the field show him oftentimes with multiple brushes in his hand. Practically speaking, for watercolor, when you're working with the lighter colors, yellows and whites in particular, you want a clean brush, and some artists would hold a clean brush in reserve for those light colors. You could imagine if there was a little bit of blue on a brush and you're trying to do a very fine, thin wash of yellow, that blue would stain and create green where you didn't want green to be. In the lower insert, we see a range of brushes that could be used for watercolor. These are modern equivalents of what was found in Sargent's studio. At the bottom, here we have a larger brush which could be used for wetting out the paper. Some larger wash brushes also for applying water or applying watercolor wash to a large area of the paper. A more modest sized wash brush, and then these smaller brushes at the end. And I suspect that the smaller fine detail brushes may come as a bit of a surprise to some of you. We think of Sargent's painting in oil and watercolor as more broadly gestural and not fine mark making, but we'll be looking at a watercolor later that illustrates his use of fine brushes. Watercolor palette, again, small, compact, hinged at the center so that it closes in half and again is even smaller. As compared to an oil palette, much larger for the very simple reason that when doing an oil painting, there's just more paint involved than working in watercolor. So what is watercolor paint? In its simplest form, it's a color and a binder, and that binder is generally gum arabic. Early on, artists would have to make their own paints, oil paint as well as watercolor, grinding the color and the binder together. When commercially prepared watercolor and oils became available, it was a great boon to the artist and freed them from studio work. You can imagine how difficult it would be grinding your paints in a controlled environment and almost impossible out in the field. Dry watercolor cakes became available at the end of the 18th century, and our watercolor in its simplest form with color and binder. Water would be added to that, a paste formed, and little blocks of color dried and formed. In order to recreate the paint, the artist would rub that cake in a saucer of water until they got the desired concentration and consistency of the color paint they wanted to use, and they would have to use that for each color block. At the beginning of the 19th century, moist colors became available with the advent of introducing glycerin to the mix. Glycerin allowed the paint to be re-wetted more easily, and an artist could touch one of these watercolor pans with a wet brush and almost instantly have paint available. Tube watercolor followed quickly after that with the invention of the collapsible paint tube. Glycerin, again, an important component in tube paint, keeping the paint from drying out in the tube, and also for tube paint there in greater quantity, offering paint of thicker consistency, of a consistency approaching oil paint, which allowed artists to add their impasto flourishes, probably not to the degree that Lydia would tell me she sees in the Sargent oil paintings, but for a watercolor, quite thick passages. Looking at the photograph of Sargent painting again and focusing on the palette in his hand, perhaps you can see the thumb wrapping over the edge of this palette. There are other photographs of Sargent working where the thumb protruding from a hole is a little bit more obvious. But with that in mind, we search the trade catalogs and look for things that, what could he possibly have been using? At the top, we see a pan set with a thumb hole. The pan colors sit in the center well, and these two side wings fold out and act as a palette, close up for easy transport. At the bottom, we have a tube set with the tube colors in the bottom and a palette to the side, which would fold and nest on top of the watercolor tubes. Looking again at this palette, we don't see a center well, and we see what seems to be a center hinge. And in other photographs of Sargent working outdoors in watercolor, similarly, we don't see a pan set in his hand. The palette seems to be tube set. This suggests that he likely worked in tube colors outdoors, although obviously he could have been using a tube palette but still working with pan colors. I would argue the convenience of a 2-in-1 in using tube color was certainly beneficial to him. And by 2-in-1, I mean that the tube color could be used thickly, as in trying to emulate certain effects in oil, but it could also be thinned down with water for thin transparent washes, the same as pan color. So if you're thinking about what you want to carry around up into the hills and you have the ability to eliminate something, this seems to me an obvious thing to eliminate. And we know from the watercolors that he was working with tube watercolors. This is a detail from the MFA's watercolor, the T's. And we can see the thicker applications of paint on the paper. And the circular nature of these daubs of paint suggests that he was squeezing directly from the tube onto the paper. We also know that Sargent worked with tube paint because of what was found in his studio and collected in his studio. This is a list of tube colors that were collected. You have it in your handouts organized by the supplier. There are European as well as American suppliers on that list. And in the course of working on the exhibition, we took the time to do a little analysis on watercolors in the Brooklyn and the MFA collections, and working with Michelle Derrick and Richard Newman, scientists at the MFA, we came up with additional colors that Sargent was using. What I would share with you is that these two lists combined likely do not reflect all of the watercolor colors that Sargent was using. And for those of you who may have additional questions about his paints, I'll try and answer those at the end of the lecture. Drawing and watercolors. Sargent drew and produced watercolors from his childhood through his adult life. His mother was an amateur watercolorist. His father did medical design drawings as well as being a medical doctor. His mother charged him with completing a watercolor and a drawing a day, and his father encouraged him to be a close observer of things and to make notations in drawing form and written notation. I find it rather ironic that he ends up in the studio of Carolus Duran, who really minimizes drawing and painting and advocates for direct painting. But with that, Sargent obviously learned a great deal from his studio experience with Carolus Duran, and it applies to the watercolors as well as the oils. But he himself knew that if he wanted to get further training in drawing, he would have to go elsewhere, and enrolled in the Écoles des Beaux-Arts, which is known for its rigorous drawing program. And drawing does appear in the watercolors. Most often, it's the starting point of the watercolors. He begins, not always, but usually with a drawing in pencil graphite. That drawing is usually rather loosely rendered, and on the more minimal side. On rare occasions, we see a highly developed, highly orchestrated underdrawing, and that's the case with Brooklyn Santa Maria della Salute, which we're looking at here. We're in this area. This is the blow-up area. These gray lines that you see are pencil lines, carefully ruled, and little tick marks that he establishes for the spacing of the columns. The architecture of the building is almost entirely ruled. The columns, the pediments, the stairs. Interestingly, when you get to the foreground of gondoliers and their boats, there's almost no underdrawing. You can see the linear lines, the horizontal lines for the stairs running through these figures, but no additional drawing to establish or place the figures in space. And that is so typical of Sargent, choosing to draw what he wants and leaving other things to the brush. This drawing from the Metropolitan Museum likely or aptly represents what the start of most of the watercolors look like in terms of the degree of underdrawing. The foliage relatively loosely rendered in the background just to establish its presence, and then Sargent placing some more important features into the composition. I would say this drawing is even more detailed than many of the watercolor underdrawings in the MFA collection. looking at one of the watercolors at the top, if you were to look at this watercolor in person, you would probably be able to see areas where the pencil drawing exists, but other areas covered by the paint. Through the magic of infrared reflectography, we're able to look through the paint layers down to the underdrawing, and this is possible with both oil paint and watercolor paint. And it works when the paint layers are transparent to the wavelengths of infrared, but the underdrawing is receptive to it and can be detected. And since Sargent's drawings for the watercolors are typically in pencil, pencil is a material that shows up. And it's represented by the linear marks that you see here as opposed to the broader washier areas. Those broader washier areas are paint application that's not completely transparent. What's interesting to look at again in comparing the upper right quadrant of the painting in the infrared image and the painting image is what Sargent chooses to draw and what he leaves out. Oops, sorry about that. I love that he wanted to isolate the nose and the upturned face of the figure here, represented here. And it's understandable. He really wanted that feature silhouetted against the green hillside, and that needed to be recorded in the underdrawing for him. But then the faces of these two central figures are totally absent in the underdrawing, totally created with the paintbrush. Similarly, the umbrella, carefully described in pencil. This figure, totally created in the brush. Sargent did not begin all of his watercolor with pencil drawing, and this wonderful watercolor of a tramp in the Brooklyn collection is an example of that. And we see the infrared image next to it, these wonderful gray washy areas representing the paint that's on the paper, but we don't have any of the linear marks associated with an underdrawing. Sargent usually used pencil as the beginnings of the watercolor, but sometimes used pencil as well as other media to have a strong role in the final visualization of the painting itself, the final painting. And that occurs in La Biancheria, the laundry, an astounding study of a very simple subject, a study of light and shadow, transmitted light and reflected light, and cool shade. But what we're going to look at here is this close-up area where the graphite pencil is used to define individual pieces of laundry rather than creating that with the brush. And I think he did it for possibly a couple of reasons. One, he could. And two, the pencil line is a much more delicate introduction and separation of items on the laundry rather than potentially the heavier hand of a brush line. Again, in a very simple but wonderful way, the laundry line itself on which I think the battery's dying on this, is hung as a graphite line as well. In this watercolor in the Brooklyn collection in Switzerland, pencil has an even stronger role than in the previous watercolor. The watercolor marks are rather loosely and broadly rendered. On their own, they don't really wrap up the shape of the subject that Sargent is painting, and he uses pencil to lasso those shapes and form those shapes. And looking more closely, we see pencil here separating the pillow from the wall. We see him giving further definition to the hand in pencil, and also much more developed in the face and the framework of the bed. Sargent didn't limit himself to drawing with pencil alone. He used a variety of materials. Another one that we're going to look at is paint and brush, and here's where we're getting back to those fine detail brushes from the earlier slide. This figure in wet quarries is enlarged for you to see. The washes of watercolor are used to give form and substance to the figure, but it's the fine brush work that describes, outlines, and defines the figure. We see fine brush work in others of the Carrara series, primarily in the ropes and pulleys used to haul the stones, but also in fine facial details in the Semplon Pass works and in some architectural features in some of the watercolors. Watercolor can be worked translucently or opaquely. Many artists choose to use both techniques in watercolor. At various times, there were camps that had very strong advocation that you can only do it all one way or all another way. Sargent didn't adhere to any of those camps, and he used both as he saw fit. And we are looking at In 11-Time Port in the Brooklyn collection, a beautiful watercolor rendered mostly in translucent watercolor, but with a few opaque touches. Looking more closely at the whole, we have a better sense of what translucent means. Specifically, it means the ability to see layers under individual layers and that the top layer doesn't totally block out everything that's below it. And you can see blue under these ochre strokes and blues layered over blues. We also have opaque areas, as in this brown, and these white strokes are also done in opaque white. They're reflections of light off water onto the hull of the ship. Looking at an Arab stable, also in the Brooklyn collection, mostly done in translucent watercolor. Sargent uses that tube consistency, that thick paint, to do the little hens underneath the horses quite wonderfully and quite economically. You see the brush strokes, the bristles of the brush that are imparted to the paint, and just a stroke down in a little arch, and you've got the perfect little hen pecking at the ground. So we've talked about Sargent using watercolor translucently, thinly, in veils of color, and also using it opaquely. And the Brooklyn collection, if you go into the Gund Gallery, spend a little bit of time in the Arab room, is where you see Sargent using opaque paint and thick paint in greatest amount. Sargent also added white paint to thin translucent washes to give the paint a sense of weight and varying degrees of opacity. By adding little bits, he could control how translucent or how opaque the wash was. And zooming in on the epicenter of the fire in the mountain fire, the red spots are squeezes of red and orange paint from the tube, again, for the flames of the fire. But we also see gradations of blue, from the truest blue being the thinnest, clearest wash of blue to paler variations. And we can see how they're both bleeding into each other, the wet wash is bleeding into each other, but density differences, and even a particulate quality in some of these washes, which is what white lends itself to the washes. And in fact, some writers on the do's and don'ts of watercolor said, never add white to your washes. It'll make them feel gritty. Well, the grittiness and the particulateness in this particular case is very effective and very evocative of smoke, and a clear decision on Sargent's part as to how to use his watercolor. Lifting and wiping is a common practice in watercolor technique. It is the artist's ability to remove watercolor from the paper when the paint is both wet and dry. Obviously, it's the quickest thing to do when the paint is still wet and just blotting it up. But one could also do it when the paint was dry by re-wetting an area, letting the water sit for a while, and then blotting the color up. Again, a great economy of purpose in the Arab stall. Sargent pulls this tail out of the dark background of the stable by dragging a water-charged brush over dry paint, letting that water sit for a moment, and then blotting it up, with the added advantage of the bristly nature of the brush transmitting very subtly to evoke the sense of the horse's tail. Corfu Lights and Shadows, one of the I'm going to say, best watercolors in the MFA collection. Truly a stunning watercolor. The subject is in the title, Lights and Shadows. And we see the shadows of trees that we expect are standing here. We certainly have the knowledge that trees are present by the foliage above the building. If he would have left this watercolor just as a study of stagnant and static shadow, it would be an incredible watercolor. But he ups it. He takes it one step further by capturing a moment in time and a sense of frozen motion with very subtle color lifting. Focusing in on a couple of, there we go, a lighter area here, lighter areas here and here. Sargent applies a little bit of water to those shadow areas, lets it sit for a moment, and blots it up in a very diffuse way. And what he's capturing is that moment when the breeze moves the branches and the sun breaks through and dissolves the shadow. And intuitively, we know in another moment when that breeze subsides, the shadow is going to reform. And such a simple thing to do, but you have to think to do it and capture the moment. And Sargent was incredibly observant and fascinated by the effects of light and shadow, trying to capture its various forms. Scraping is a physical way of removing paint from watercolor. It can be done when the paint is wet or dry. It can be done with a variety of tools, from fingernails, thumbnails, the wood end tip of a brush, but also tools were sold for that purpose. And here we see a variety of scrapers and erasers. The erasers have the broader head. The scrapers are the final point. They could be used for making corrections. They could be used for introducing highlights or details. I would say Sargent rarely felt the need to make a correction in a watercolor. I think he spent more time making corrections in oil painting, and again with watercolor as his escape. He let things be as they were and didn't over-worry little things that might not be to another artist's satisfaction. Sargent used scraping to introduce texture, to introduce highlights, and he also used it as a drawing tool, as we see in Carrara Workmen. Looking at the detail of the two figures at the left, most especially, we see him scratching out the detail in the soles of the shoe, but also the edge of the jacket, more so in this figure, describing the folds behind the knee, the arms, the shoulders there. Literally carving out from paint and paper the describing lines for these figures. In Mountain Brook, we also have scratching and scraping, much more subtly applied, but really rather vigorously and aggressively. In the mid-ground area, mixed in with his use of wax, which we'll be talking about next, he uses it to create a scruffiness or a mossiness in the mid-ground slope of the hill. And if you're in the gallery and wanting to look at this, I would suggest probably looking in the area behind and above this figure's head as a more visible area of scratching. He does it in a more refined way in the figure itself. The highlight back of the head, and these very fine scratches to delineate the brim of the hat, and then this deeper score for the highlight in the collar. So now wax. Sargent is like a crazy man with the wax. No one before that I've been able to find, or even after, has used wax in quite the same way and mixing it with watercolor. Wax and water just don't go together, so intuitively they're not something that one would join. Erica used the analogy of Easter egg dyeing, which is absolutely applicable. The wetter the wash, the more the wax will repel. The wetter the wash means there's more water there. If you're using a drier wash of color, you can get it to stick a little bit if you want. Looking at this detail of Trajan's quarry, these scribbly marks are represented by wax. If wax is applied directly onto the paper, it's almost invisible on its own. It really doesn't have much of a color or content to it. It's only once a wash of watercolor is applied that it miraculously emerges and becomes obvious. When those highlights are white, the wax is directly on the paper. When the highlights have a color tint to them, he's applied the wax over an underlying color layer, which is what we're looking at here in this watercolor of the sculpture Daphne. And specifically looking at the flowers here. Sargent applied pink and yellow watercolor to the paper directly and then covered those colors with wax, knowing that he was going to go back with washes of green and brown more generally in the background, and he wanted to protect those colors. So you see the little spots on the pink there, that's little bits of following watercolor washes that have not completely spalled off the surface of the wax and are very tenuously stuck to the wax. And looking at a little bit more closely this detail, this sort of crystalline-looking structure is the wax, and these little beads of color is the watercolor that did not completely spall off the wax surface. As I mentioned at the beginning of the section on wax, Sargent used wax for, or maybe I didn't, but Sargent used wax for highlight reserves, he used it for textural effects, and he also used it as a drawing tool, and we see all of that in the garden wall. The highlights in the door sill are made by wax on the paper, reserves protected from following watercolor washes. The rough texture in the wall to suggest either stone or a stucco surface is created by scribbling wax and interlayering it with watercolor washes. And then some drawn strokes to establish the bench on which she's sitting. Looking at this more closely, we see one of the few Sargent, in my mind, oopses, which is this works really well as a white highlight reserve, but running through her knees a white line, not so much, not a good idea. And even Sargent, who was very tolerant of wayward things in the watercolors, this wasn't going to fly. So in these two areas in particular, I think you might be able to make out little strokes of blue, but throughout these lines and here as well, Sargent went back with drier watercolor to mute down those drawn lines of wax. I'd like to finish with the en plein air, Sargent working out of doors. In the course of working on an exhibition with a group of people, it's a really nice way of working. You have discussions and questions and you think about different things. And one of the things that we have talked about and continue to talk about is whether or not Sargent completed these watercolors outdoors or whether or not he brought them back to the studio to finish them off. What I would say is it's likely that at some time he did bring some of these watercolors back and work on them further. For the most part, I personally believe that most of these watercolors were completed outdoors for several reasons. One, there are accounts by numerous friends and family saying how quickly he worked in watercolor. One person saying he generally did them in one go, and if some condition of lighting or such changed, maybe a second go. One go to me is at most a day. I mean, one go doesn't extend over multiple days, and so the watercolor would be finished. Using this set of photographs, I would argue that the watercolor, the reading, which is represented by the setup we see here, was completed in one day in one sitting. Looking again at the overview of this, this watercolor session, we see a very arranged sitting. Sargent has placed the figures as he wanted, arranged the umbrellas as he wanted, controlling the lighting effects almost as if it's an outdoor photo studio. We see similarities, obvious similarities in the photograph here with the final watercolor with some small differences. Maybe not so small if it was you or I trying to paint this setting, but Sargent doesn't use the shawl in the final version, and the heads are positioned somewhat differently. This is another photograph of this particular watercolor sitting, and we see Emily, Sargent's sister, behind him watching him paint the scene before him. And coming up a little, zooming in on this particular watercolor he's working on, and also taking into account it's somewhat distorted because of the way the camera is capturing it. We see the reading playing out here, the dark shadow in the shape of the umbrella, the dark shadow shape of the umbrella here as well, and I think more telling, the white line and the white part of the skirt, the curve of the arm here, and the curve of the dress behind. I would argue that this watercolor was completed outdoors for the fact that we see white highlights on the watercolor pad in front of him. And these watercolor highlights are opaque paint, thick tube paint, and white highlights are typically the last thing to go onto a watercolor. And with that, that's my last comment for my talk. And thank you all.
So we ask that those who are leaving do so quietly, and please raise your hand. We'll bring you a mic for the questions.
I have a question about the technique of using wax. Is that analogous to using a crayon modern day, or did they actually use like candle wax? Could you just elaborate a little on that, please?
I would love to elaborate on that. I would love to elaborate it on more than I have the knowledge of in researching this, because it is fascinating. No one's done this before, and I dare say it's not used in any great extent by many artists afterwards. In looking at the trade catalogs, I could not see clear wax crayons being sold. Modeling wax for forming sculptures and that sort of thing, most certainly. Wax as a frisket or a barrier material was available to watercolor artists. This would have been a wax emulsion, maybe more a liquid that could be painted on a surface to protect an area. So he would have been familiar with friskets and barriers, and that may have triggered the idea for using wax in the way he uses it, in part. But in the stick form, I could not find anything being sold. It may well be that he was going to a candle shop and, you know, just using the tip of a candle to do it, at least at the beginning of things. And I think his reason for turning to wax is to have another way of retaining those highlights in the background. He was using scraping and quite vigorous scraping. I think he might have found that a little crude, and he couldn't achieve the same kind of subtle effects that he could with wax. What exactly sort of flipped his switch, so to speak, that he came up with this, I'm not sure. But I think it was a progression in a way from knowledge of friskets, and that wax was involved in that, and candles were obviously something that would have been available to him, and it may well be that was his source. I don't know if I pick or if you people pick.
You mentioned the elaborate underdrawing in the beginning on the church, and we've also heard that he did a lot of his drawings in a gondola. What
What
was
do I
going
think
on
about
there?
that?
Yeah, do you know what happened there?
Well, I have my
How he could
theory,
control it?
and you know, I think conservators as well as art historians develop their theories based on the information available. But my theory is that particular building, La Salute, Sargent painted a lot in watercolor and oil paint from various vantage points. He drew it a lot, he painted it a lot. Of any of the watercolors that we've looked at, That one, I wonder about whether or not it was done in the studio, and thus a more orchestrated version of something that he had done previously in a gondola. I agree, doing that kind of ruled underdrawing, you know, it's not as if there are big crashing waves on the Great Lagoon, but it's not a steady format for doing ruled lines.
Would he have used photography?
A lot of discussion about photography and Sargent. Sargent certainly took photographs. Friends talk about him photographing the clouds. We have photographs that show his setup that we know cameras were part of his entourage. As a child, as his family visited various museums and sites, we know that he collected photographs of artwork, and there was a tradition, especially for American art students who didn't have the European collections available, to be drawing and painting from photographs. So it's all of that would, and at the École des Beaux-Arts, they have a collection of photographs available to students and instructors to use. Another friend of Sargent's said that he was open to any device. He didn't feel the need to apply every device to every situation, but he certainly was adventurous in that way, and if a particular tool met a need, he would have availed himself of it. I don't think he needed to work from photographs. He drew copiously, and very minor changes in position or framework. But again, if it served a purpose, I believe he would have used it.
I have a question about the sculptures in the rotunda, because I'm under the impression that he was not a sculptor, and I thought that what probably happened is that he sketched and supervised the sculptures, but that he did not do them himself.
He had no formal training as a sculptor, as far as we know, but the images that Thomas Fox took that we were able to have printed show really clearly that Sargent was, he would have structure, the underlying structure of the bas-relief built for him based on designs that he made, but he himself actually made, you know, he used like a version of an oil-based clay, like a plastiline, so that it wouldn't dry out. But he would build up the structure of those bas-reliefs himself. And then he would have them cast in plaster. And Sargent, being Sargent, turns out he went in after the plaster casts had been made and then toned them to bring out certain elements of the sculptures. And we know this because we found versions, casts of the plaster behind the rotunda, behind the dome, up in sort of the attic storage area, wrapped up in newspaper. When written across them, it said, "Do not exhibit." But they actually had paint tones on the bas-reliefs. So we know he did it all.
Incredible. I changed my tour.
We've heard a lot from all of you about what pleasure Sargent got from the watercolors, from doing watercolors. And I'm just wondering, does anybody know what the emotional kick was? Why did this give him such pleasure?
No one was paying him to do them. He was doing them for himself. And it's only until later in his career, mostly at the nudging of Ned Boyd to show with him in New York at the first Knoedler exhibition, that he amasses a sizable number of watercolors to show with Ned Boyd. He was showing his watercolors occasionally earlier. He wasn't going to get the same amount of money for his watercolors. He really didn't want to be bothered with selling the watercolors, so it was more a nuisance than a source of profit for him. So, well, he was doing watercolors from his childhood. His mother was a watercolor artist. It was a material familiar to him. There's a luminosity that's possible in watercolor that is achievable, and he certainly achieves it in his oils, but not the same kind of reflectant luminosity from thin veils of watercolor. I think the watercolors did offer him something aside from an escape from oil portraiture. It was a different medium that offered some different things for him that, for someone particularly interested in light, was a spectacular choice of medium for him.
We have time for one last question.
My question is about removing the varnish. When you remove the varnish, when you were conserving the paintings, do you go ahead and put more varnish on afterwards?
We find that, particularly with the portraits, Sargent was, once again, very traditional in his working methods with his oil paintings, and they would have all been varnished. He, particularly because of his use of some of those very dark pigments and broad areas of very dark paint, those stretches without a varnish, as they age, tend to turn quite matte. We often see areas where materials kind of work their way out of the paint and create a haze on the surface, which you don't see when the painting has varnish on it. Many of the studies, in fact, there are some of the studies for the Boston Public Library murals in the collection at Harvard where this phenomenon has happened because they weren't varnished. And so you start to have a very difficult time reading the folds of draperies and things because of these materials coming out of the oil paint itself. We did not varnish the murals because they had not ever been varnished, and that was Sargent's choice. He clearly was very aware of the difference of effects of a varnished painting versus an unvarnished one. The murals at the BPL, for example, were varnished. Ours were not. So he was very conscious of those effects, but when we work on something, we do replace a varnish if it was there in the first place. We would not apply a varnish if the painting had not had one to begin with. I guess that's it. Thank you very much for coming today.